Okay, who in here's done modelling before? Okay, so number one, I'm going to correct that misapprehension. You're all modellers, okay? No one here has knowingly put their hand on a hot stove, right? You put a hat on when it's sunny, you take an umbrella when it's raining, you don't touch hot things, you're all modellers. They're all models of the way the world works, okay? So number one, you're all modellers. So I'm just going to go over here a little bit of how you make an ecosystem or a marine model. So the first key part to do is to pick your question, to pick your spot, know what you actually want to be doing in the first place. It's the same as doing any other science. So you also have to make a decision about what you put in that model. So for every time you decide to put something in, you're deciding that you're not going to put in about 10,000 other things. So you should actually make that a pretty conscious decision, not something that you accidentally fall into. So this is a bit of a biophysically heavy checklist. I should actually expand this to cover more of the human stuff explicitly. But these are the kinds of processes that you need to sit down and think about whether you need when you start building a model. You don't need all of it necessarily, but you need to have thought about whether it influences the system that you're going to build. Do you need the environment? For asking climate questions, likely we need some kind of environmental driver. Do we need a food web? Or can we get away with a single species? Do we need a habitat for those animals to live? How do we represent the human drivers on the system? Is it just a mortality rate? Or do we need to represent the economics? Do we need to represent the way that people make their decisions? So over the couple of lectures I'll give today, I think I'll help you see that there's lots of options about how to do that. There's also no one best model. So I have a 22-year-old son who's convinced he needs a Harley Davidson motorcycle. Given the fact he can't drive and he barely rides his bicycle, and the person who would likely have to buy for it, I disagree, okay? He really only needs to get from point A to point B. So in his head, he has a whole bunch of criteria for his model, his desire for a motorbike, that I don't share. So he thinks he needs one to impress girls. I'm not so convinced on that one. I think he just needs to get to work. So I'm happy with the bicycle idea. So this is the same kind of principle with models. You don't go for the biggest possible, toughest model to build at the outset. You might need it down the track if you really need all those components. But you might find that a simple model is actually just fine. Or you might find that you need something in the middle. So Ingrid is quite beautiful on her little aesthetic as she puts around, and it does exactly what she needs it to do. So some of those intermediate models are the best of both worlds. They've got the extra dimensions, such as the human dimension, without overlaying too much complexity, because complexity will be your biggest pain. There's lots of different kinds of models out there. This is my classification of the way the world works based on models. So there's what we call conceptual models, which you literally draw with pieces of paper. Or in my experience, I've drawn them with Aboriginal elders in the sand with a big stick. Okay, you can do these anywhere. You can do it in stories. Humans are a storytelling species. We love to tell stories about the past and the future. They're just conceptual models of the way we think the world works. Okay, so they have the same kinds of components as any model. They have the biophysical world, the social and economic world, but done in a very simple way. You don't have to bring in mathematics straight away. You can actually do maths on those models though and get quantified perturbation responses out of them. So they can be highly mathematical outcomes, suitable for advising management, just drawn with, literally a stick and a ball. From there you get into the simple models that you can play with more quantitatively. So old scientists, typically men with white beards, hate the word toy. They think it's being disrespectful to the society of science. But we learn absolutely the most about the world in the first 10 years and every time we play. We're more relaxed, we're taking in more information, and we're not afraid of making mistakes when we're playing, okay? So that's the way that you should take on model. That you're a little kid in a sandbox. Think of it as your ultimate Lego set. You can bolt bits together. And you'll learn the most and you'll understand the most about the way systems work, playing in the models. The more formal models that we see used in decision analysis typically take three different forms. They pick on one part of the system, so in this case I picked a stock assessment model, so yes, it's the biophysical world, they have a lot of detail on, and the other bits are just little drivers, but equally it could be an economics model written by Rashid that has its big box in the middle and just a little bit of drivers from the other parts. Or if Ingrid was making it, it might be down in this big social part, or just a little bit from everybody. So you can put the focus in one spot. Or you can start to more evenly handle all three parts. So there's a kind of models that we call MICE models, so minimum realistic models, or models of intermediate complexity. And they start to more evenly handle all the parts, but they don't have the degree of complexity of some of the really big models. So as someone who works in this N space, they're really, really hard to get to work well. Whereas these often do pretty much the same kind of answers, but are much easier to do, they're much easier to statistically fit. And people are more willing to use them because they match their expectations based on this one. So most of the world uses these kinds of models. So you'll hear on Australian news that the economic model says investment's going to drop. They're really just using this kind of model with the economic problem. So the world is already pre-set up to accept information from these kind of models because in many ways the outputs look like this stuff. So that's why they're a very effective way of getting operational management, operational outcomes on the kinds of questions you guys are asking around climate change and ecosystem effects. The reason to think about all of those different areas is because the marine world covers 14 orders of magnitude and scale, from the microbial scale and the molecular scale all the way up to the entire global drivers. And it seems insane to want to put all of that in a single model. I've done it, and it is pretty insane to do. But the reason for thinking about all those scales is that if we think about just a single beach, just say we're thinking about the beach we're going to go to at lunchtime, that beach is actually influenced across 10 orders of magnitude on the way that the animals on it live, the waves coming in, what's driving those waves. And so the poor bloke who has to manage the beach has to actually be on a day-to-day basis dealing with 4 orders of magnitude. So scale is really important in the way that you put a model together. There's also the different kinds of models. So in the course of the 20 years that I've been doing models, you do see a little bit of a hierarchy where people doing predictions think that they're a lot more special than the rest of us because they can exactly see what's going to happen in the short term. And their models are quite complicated. I'm not taking anything away from them. But it takes a very different mindset to play with the kind of what-if models that do projections. Because it's a very much a, what if this happened, or what if this is important? It's a very different scale. So to give you a little bit of a visual implication of this scale, this is your Whatif World. It's an iceberg of opportunities and hidden understanding versus what is a very complicated system of an ice cube, but it has a very tailored thing that you want to do with the ice cube, whereas the Whatif World is way more complicated. Both kinds of models are dictated by the feedbacks at their heart. What are the leverage points, the interconnection points between the different parts of the system, either biophysical or human, and how do you represent those connections? So the approach that I spend most of my life working on is trying to model all the different parts of the adaptive management cycle. So not just the real world and how it works, but also how humans exploit that world, what drives their decisions in the way that they do that, but also how does science and management decisions fit into that, and how can it be used to redirect what's happening. Now the beauty of doing that in the model world is that you can deal with uncertainty. You can swap in and out different ways that that world works. We don't have a perfect knowledge of how the world works. So you can swap in and out. The other good thing is you can do this with people who live in the system. So there will inevitably be some guy in a stakeholder workshop who goes, no, the world doesn't work like this, it works like that. So you swap in his version of the world and see if you can get it to work. They often learn the most when they can see that their view of the way the world works doesn't actually hold up once you try to wind the handle. Okay, so you can be, as Billy Christensen said, we're agnostic as modelers. It's not a religion, you can have more than one model, okay? So that's the way to take that approach. We also don't optimise. This is where Rashid and I have parted company in the past on many different occasions. As a modeler, I don't optimise. I don't try to find that single best solution. I say what does work and doesn't work under different situations and then leave it up to the managers to see what they really want to do with it. What we're trying to identify is what never works, what works under some situations and not others, and if we can do what's called the minimum sustainable whinge. So a whinge in Australia is when you're complaining and you're whining and, oh, this is wrong and that's wrong and everything's going to doom. So if you can get people to be minimally happy, so their base requirements are happy, that's about the best you can do, because you can't have everybody super happy at the same time. It just never works. You can't get everything to line up. So if you can get people to at least be minimally happy with the situation, you've probably found the best possible outcome.
This sounds like politics.
It does very much sound like politics. So in terms of what we can do with models, we can now model every single understood process in the biological and the biophysical world. They're done with differing degrees of complexity and resolution and ability, but we can actually represent every single part of the eco world now in models. On the human side of things, I would argue that we have at least crude representations of every part of the way the human world works too. Our biggest challenge has been in trying to tie down the evolution of human institutions and government dynamics, but even that can be done. Sometimes it can be done in a rather cheeky way. I don't know if you've ever heard of a random walk, but it's when you kind of have a little bit of variation around the trend. The best way of modelling the management decision process of the Northeast Fisheries Council in the US is as a random walk, which is pretty much how many political decisions can be very well modelled and very well fit today. So how do we go about understanding what we need to put in it? So every aspect of building a model comes down to how much detail you're going to put in. So one of the first details to think about is what kind of processes do you actually want to represent? What do you have to have explicit and what can you leave out? The key part of that is about understanding the feedbacks in the system. So it's every modeller's instinct to build it in parts and just have one part flow on to the next part. We saw that yesterday in Laurent's presentation where they have the scenarios for the biophysical world, for instance. So they're tied in a one-way session. This is what physics does, and the biology does this in response, and the humans do that in response, okay? But in reality, there's feedbacks between that whole thing. So humans haven't done the worst-case RCP scenario because there's been economic feedbacks that have led to different decision outcomes. So we need to think about what some of those feedbacks are, because feedbacks are usually the fundamental thing dictating dynamics and the surprises in the system. So this is certainly a good place to start. You have to start with the building blocks, but you then have to think about other feedbacks, because a positive feedback will wind up the system and make it unstable, whereas a negative feedback takes the sting out and is usually where your best source of sustainable management options come from. So there's lots of different ways of doing modelling. When I started modelling more than 20 years ago, the physics world didn't even talk to the fish, let alone the human parts. Through time that has changed so that the models do connect. Many models now at least have some representation of the influence of the other parts of the system. They may still put a lot of focus on one key part, such as the key target fish, the way that it's fished and what it eats, but will have some environmental drivers. There's more and more models that have tried to make this connection. So when I first started, there were maybe 3 ecosystem models used regularly in the world. And now there's more than 35 different ecosystem models that are contributing to the IPCC work. Okay, so it's become a far more populous topic. What we've learned in trying to do this, though, is that this solution of trying to be evenly handed everywhere doesn't really work. It's very hard to do. So there's a couple of other solutions. One's called the rhomboid approach, where you put a lot of focus on a key part and sort of telescope away from it, so you gently ease off on the detail as you move away from that key part. And then you can link those kinds together to cover the system. Well, the one that's showing the most promise is called hybrid models, where you take the best way of representing each part of the system and you tie them together Frankenstein-wise, like the Franken model that Paul was talking about yesterday, so that you've patched together a vision of that world and its interactions. Because, let's face it, the real world isn't identical in every part. The biology doesn't work exactly the same as economics, or exactly the same as psychology. So why do we think a single way of representing all those different things would work? So you take what works for each part, and you stick it together. So as a part of my PhD, I looked at what's the effective complexity on the performance of models, and over the last 20 years, we've continued to fill this in. So there is a very strong surface found in all forms of modelling to do with the complexity. So how well does the model perform versus how complex it is? So there's this effectiveness boundary. So if we think of it as a map, so I don't really drink a lot of cocktails, I will have the odd one, but I'm very keen on ice cream. So I want to get to the best ice cream store in the town, okay? If someone hands me a blank sheet of paper as the map, I'm not going to be able to find that ice cream store. If someone gives me a complex GPS that's got all the people and all the animals and all the cars on the road, I'm just as lost as the real world, and there's cumulative errors on all those parts, I'm even more lost. What I need is just that street map with the X, okay? Then I can find the ice cream store. That's an intermediate complexity model that's given me the most amount of information possible. That's what you're aiming for. Now, it's still possible for a bad modeler to screw up a good model. So this, just being up here doesn't guarantee good performance. You can still end up here. I can still get lost in my own backyard, so maps aren't always that helpful for me. But I have the best potential at that intermediate complexity. So the best approach to doing this kind of work, and it's been recommended by the FAO, is to actually look at what scales make sense. Don't try and use the same scale for every part. So you don't try and represent, so just say if we start with Laurent's model, that's a 1/10 of a degree resolution for the entire global ocean, we then don't try and map people acting on that 1/10 of a degree. We use a global economics model to think about how to, or national scale model, to think about how the nations respond. So not everything is forced onto the same grid. Okay? So you tailor the grid to the bits that you need for each part. You have to actually also think about the uncertainty coming from different parts of linking that model together. So even for non-modelers, we've probably all heard of parametric uncertainty, when you have to change the values of growth or the values of mortality to see how sensitive the model outputs are to the values of those parameters. Because we can't sample the world in such a way that we know those things exactly. There's actually a far bigger sensitivity in a model. It's called structural uncertainty. It's how you put that model together in the first place. So if I'm a predatory fish and I'm swimming around and I'm eating things, if the model says I'm never allowed to eat rashid, that could be really important compared to if I am allowed to eat rashid. We might get completely different dynamics if I was allowed to do that. Okay, so sometimes a zero is really important. How you put those connections together is really important. Okay, so the next part is going to be a bit like interpretive dance. But we're going to imagine putting a model together a bit like setting up a stage play. So just say we're going to have a stage play based in a kitchen. So first of all, we need to have a kitchen, which is the centre of the stage here. In the kitchen, we need some basic props. We need the basic processes that happen in a kitchen. So if it's anything like my kitchen, you need somewhere to sit. Or in my case, for my children, not sit, because they're inevitably late for the bus and they're sprinting through the kitchen. We need somewhere to cook. So we'll pretend that there's a stove here. We need people in the kitchen. So congratulations, you get to be in the kitchen. So now we have the key features. We have the seamount, for instance. This might be a seamount model. These are the seamounts, and this is the animals living on the seamount. And this is the human fishery come together, okay? But in our kitchen sense, we have the person in the kitchen, we have the chairs in the kitchen, but we don't want to represent all the details of the kitchen. He doesn't want to know that there's cockroaches in my kitchen, okay? We don't want to have to represent the scuttling of the cockroach in fine detail across the floor. We might want to represent his response to a cockroach running past. What would you do if a cockroach went past? So we get the effect of the cockroach without having the actual cockroach represented. So that's a subgrid scale process. How do you represent the effect of a tiny detail that has a big effect without getting sucked into representing all that extra detail? Okay, so that's a really important part of doing modelling, is to understand what you need to explicitly represent, your key features of the system, your key parts of the system, but not to get sucked into extraneous details. Represent that through other imaginative ways. You can escape the kitchen. So the scale of the action of the components is also really important. You don't necessarily want to have to dictate everything at that finer scale, but even how you go about representing scale is important. So if we think about space, there's two main ways of doing space. There's the grid sense, so that's the easiest way, is just to break up the world into fairly regular shapes. So grids or triangles are often used in hydrodynamic models. They're the easiest one for us to get our heads around because we're regularly dividing up the world into nice little parcels. They're really hard to provide enough data for, to get one piece of data, let alone multiple pieces of data, in every one of those grid cells. So this is an example from the Azores, where this is an eco-space model of the Azores, and this is an Atlantis model at the same location. So what we do, the other way of representing space, is to represent it the same way that it works in reality. It's patchy. There's some parts where very fine scale details are really important, like where the island breaks the surface. There's other parts where we can use mathematical tricks to represent what's going on. So yes, there might be some big eddies out here, but we know there's always a big eddy there somewhere. So we can use a statistical property to represent that eddy. So we're matching the representation of space to the patchiness of the place we're trying to model. It's much harder mentally to get your head around that, but it's much better supported by data, particularly when I started. So back when I started modelling, I had a computer that was actually slightly less powerful than my watch. My watch wasn't very good then, but it's a better watch now. So I had to think about this kind of process. We get sloppy the more computing power we have. We try to add more in. We don't necessarily keep ourselves as strictly rigorous. But the same decisions are really important to how we represent space even today. So this is an example from a global model that Laurent has worked a little bit with, I think. But the basic principle was that they had a fine grid scale mesh across the world. They were trying to represent the physical forcing in a global climate model. And they found they were doing really poorly, well, reasonably poorly, at predicting the temperatures in these upwelling locations. So anywhere it's yellow and red, they weren't doing very well. Actually, they weren't doing very well, it was super cold either, but let's just focus on these red spots. So what they found was that the important physical processes were happening at a finer scale than they were representing here. So they took the approach of grabbing different shapes. So it's fairly common now in hydrodynamics to use different shaped, not a regular grid to try and telescope in key spots. But you can also embed super fine grids within these key areas, and that's the approach that they took, trying to solve the problem. So out here in the open ocean, they could get away with a larger grid, and then they had a telescoping, a nested grid inside in these key locations. And the performance was much, much better. So it's because it was matching the scale of the model to the scale of the most important processes happening. So it's again easiest for us to think of taking the same systematic approach to every part of the model, so everything is treated the same, but the world doesn't work that way. So you have to telescope in and out to put your focus where the key focus of the process is at. Similarly, this is another example from Australia. This was a coarse grid model. We were trying to do climate species projections off, and we couldn't even reproduce what was happening today. And it was because of the importance of eddies. So when we moved to the finer scale that could reproduce these eddies, we found that there were features that we just didn't see in the other model, and details that were really important to how larval transport, for instance, worked. So we had to match the scale of the model to the processes that were important. Now that's true in the way that we do time as well. So the easiest way that most people do time in the model is to have the same step apply to every part of the model. So everything is walking together in lockstep like soldiers marching together. But again, that's not the way the world works. Sharks have a very different lifespan to phytoplankton. Okay, so phytoplankton might even have 2 or 3 generations in a single day. There's a fish called the orange ruffy in Australia. It can live 400 years. So it has a very different lifespan and speed of doing things to phytoplankton. So one of the tricks to deal with that is to let the humans and the slow things like fish have their big steps, and to let the plankton have adaptive little steps that build up. so that they're each acting on their normal time frame as well. It's much more numerically and mathematically stable too. You get away from mathematical artifacts by doing it that way. You can actually also take that principle a bit further. So, I don't know about you, but when I'm asleep, I'm really asleep, because you have to put a bomb under me to wake me up, basically. So if you were to model Beth, you could get away with about 6 hours of one big time step, where she's doing nothing, and then some moderate time steps when she's sort of slowly waking up, and then the, oh crap, I'm late, so really fine time steps as I run out the door and get to the place on time. It's the same with animals. You can have really large time steps when they're, whatever. Okay, see, that was a fast time step just then. So that you can have slow time steps when they're doing their sort of day-to-day processes, like resting, or like a slow turtle nesting, for instance. That's a pretty slow process. And then when they're running away from predators, it can zoom in. So that sounds like a pretty complicated way of doing things, and the technology must be really hard, but it's not. Every single one of you are using one of those models pretty much right now, because it's in the operating system of your computer works exactly that way. So if you take that technology and put it into a model, you can have telescoping time where you can allow for migrations, you can allow for spawning events and predation feeding events in a process called agent-based modeling, which I'll get to later in the day. You do need some tricks behind that, a regular heartbeat to make sure you don't get too divergent in time. We had a problem in one model where we couldn't understand how this predator was eating the prey, because the predator was still migrating when the prey suddenly died, and forgot they were on different time loops, and the predator was effectively eating ghost prey that wasn't really there. So you do have to have some things to peg your time correctly, but the approach itself is really flexible. Now, if we go beyond space and time, you get into the taxonomic resolution. So we think about the way that global models have evolved over the last close to century. Basically, they started off with the physical drivers, and then they brought in the things that dictate production. So they brought in phytoplankton, and then slowly through time, that's been pieced up till we get to fish. So initially, that was done in that sequential of we have the physics information that drives the primary production, that drives where the fish can be, which drives where the larvae end up, which drives where the adults are. Because those parts are now in place, they're being more dynamically tied to each other with feedbacks, but all of those different components of the models now exist, with the major processes being captured, so movement and growth. But you can go beyond just a single species representation into the food web, and this is where some of the really big things about getting your process scale right come into play. So when you represent a food web, I can't tell you the amount of times I've seen an ecopath model get sent to me where it's got 10 different kinds of birds, 4 different kinds of orcas, 25 fish, and then benthic invertebrates as a single entry, with no differentiation between them. So you end up with an animal in my imagination that looks somewhat like this creature up in the top end. It's an amalgam of all these different processes, which doesn't really work. So you have to think about the representation of animals just like anything else. You have to split out how they use the habitat, how they feed, how do they use temperature profiles of the seabed, or what's their role in the system. So ontogeny and non-trophic interactions are really important in that, not just food web, and then how they use space is pretty important stuff too. So you can get to those food webs through conversations with ecologists or doing statistical PCA analyses and all those kind of things. One method that's really handy is called regular coloration. So it's actually invented by an ecologist and then completely ignored by ecology and picked up by the social sciences. So it's used in social network theory quite a lot, but it actually comes out with the same kind of food web structures when applied to ecology that you'd get by having ecologists tell you. So you can cross-check your ecological outcomes with a statistical method, which keeps your viewers happy. You stop getting hit over the head for using expert information. So the way that it works is it takes the animals and it colours them based on shared links. So if there's a primary producer eaten by these animals, so this animal here isn't eaten by any of those, so it gets its own change, its own colours. Where here both of these eat that and are eaten by those. So you can colour those and combine them together into a single functional group. Similarly, the pinks both eat blue and they're both eaten by brown, so you can shrink the pinks into a single entry and the browns into a single entry. So you can get system simplification and a rigorous food web without having to go into enormous detail, because you can't represent every species out there. The other major thing you've got to avoid doing is explicitly lumping very clear predators and prey. So omnivores make the life a little bit more difficult. But if it's a clear predator and a clear prey, you'll get numeric and ecological artefacts come up if you try and lump them together. That's a situation where you should probably just leave one out rather than trying to lump it all together. The other thing to remember is you have to be a little bit pragmatic. You do have to draw the line somewhere and say, look, I can't put everything in. But as a modeller, then you have to be very aware that there's missing parts that could become important in the future. So, for example, Carl Walters calls them the vampires in the basement. They're the things that come out of nowhere to get you when you least expect it. A bit like a horror movie. It is often when your model's not working, particularly in a projection sense, it's because there was an important process or group that you hadn't appreciated because it had a low role in the past that comes up to be important. So sometimes models can predict those shifts, but if you've left a group or a process out because you thought it wasn't important, just be aware that there could be situations where that's not true, so that you can't ironclad guarantee that you've covered everything. You also shouldn't tie things down. So quite a few times I've been handed models to play with where the person has tied down the community composition because this is what's been observed. It's kind of the wrong way of doing it. You need to put in the processes that support that community to be that way without hardwiring the community. So you put in the key drivers and the processes, and the community composition should emerge. So it's those emergent properties that are the way of testing that you've actually got the content of your model in a form that will be useful when you're projecting it forward, when you don't know what that future state will really look like. This is an example of a way that some guys in the Bering Sea have put together a model. It's kind of a good example of the way that these models are evolving on the climate scale. So they've got their climate scenarios that drive their downscaled biophysical model, their ROMS model. Inside that, they've got a quite detailed plankton model, which is conditioned by ice and a little bit of what's happening in the benthos. And then they send that as food into quite some age and size structured fish models, with their biggest concentration being on cod and forage fish. So there's equally as much detail in the fisheries and economics that I couldn't represent here, but they have actually picked out the key players through their system rather than trying to represent everything. Still can end up quite complex, and in their case it stands out as a good example to me because they used both a little bit of humour but a little bit of smarts to help dictate where the fish go. They have a happiness index, a fish happiness index. Is it a nice place to spawn? Is there nice food? Is it a pleasant temperature? Oh, we're really happy about that spot, we'll go over there. So it's how they dictate their movement. There's other ways of taking on the topic, and there's actually someone who's playing with this model somewhere in the audience. So this is a size spectrum model from Julia Blanchard. So it uses the concept that in the pelagic world, size matters. It dictates most of the interactions between predators and prey, with predators eating things that are a little bit smaller than them. But the benthic world works really differently. So for many of the early size models, they just ignored the benthic world. But shallow shelves are really dependent on what happens in that benthos. You can't ignore it. So you have to take a different approach to representing that benthic world and then tie the two together. That similar kind of thinking is also what you need to do on the human side. So just as we've broken down the physics and the space and the biology and the processes, you need to do that for the humans. What are the important processes you need to represent? It might be that fishing mortality is enough. It might be that an economic drive is enough. But in some situations, it can be a lot more complicated. So I was working in a place in Mexico. We were trying to understand what was the driving pressure for why the fishermen were doing the pattern of fishing that they had. In this particular location, it was actually to do with the combination of wind and whether there was going to be a major university event in the United States in the foreseeable future. Because the fishermen would every day get up and decide, today am I a fisherman or am I a drug runner? So they would make their decision based on the wind, the local fish market price, and whether there would be a demand for their product at the other end. So it was a very much more complicated situation than just being purely driven by just one thing like the environment. or the other thing like the economics, because there was the penalty function of if you got caught, you couldn't do anything. So there was some psychological and risk factors involved as well. The reason to start teasing out more of this human behaviour is if you take a fishing mortality approach to representing fishing, it's certainly the fastest and the simplest, and you can get it going in under a day, but it would assume at the base level a homogeneous spread of fishing pressure across this entire region. Whereas by representing the behaviour of the fishermen, you can get the fact that it's patchy. So the red areas are places where there's more effort in catching tuna. You can only get to that by representing more of the decision processes from the human side. So sometimes representing human behaviour can be really important. For some questions you even have to think at a global scale. So I'm not saying that for every little reef that you're modelling you have to suddenly think of a global trade network, but where trade is an important part, sometimes you do have to think of the national role of those trade interactions. This was an example for forage fish, where they had to think about what were the flows and demands between the different locations before they could actually come back to do a good projection of what those places might look like going forward. Another part of representing it is the role of us, the scientists, and monitoring in these models. How do you capture the way that we would if you're going to be mimicking this work? So, for instance, in a fisheries question, you might want to represent how industry-dependent data is collected or fisheries-independent data, so that you can understand some of the ways that if you're making a management suggestion just based on catch data, how could that go wrong? So that you can play out in the model world and see the ways that that data might go wrong, so that you can understand whether it's going to be a reliable means of making management decisions. Then you get to models in action. Let's see if I can get this to work. So there's two ways of thinking about models in action. One is to give you some examples, which I'll do in a bit more. But the other way is in helping people see what that world might look like. So we live in a world now where Avatar is kind of the standard that people are expecting when they think about it. So in Australia, you've been able to graduate from high school without maths or science for 15 years now. So the average literacy of the Australian population is going down. They can't read time series plots. So we've had to revert to using things like animations to get across to what's going on. So this is actually an example from UBC, from the EWE model platform, but using the model. So this is model output here, and the game engine runs across the top of that and then generates what that world might look like. And that can help people visualise the different futures. So this is an example from Australia where we were trying to look at tourism and fisheries along the west coast of Australia. So this is an agent-based model where there was only 2,000 people that lived there. So we had a one-to-one model of every human being, including both the residents going down to run the tourist boat or off to be at the shopping centre, the way the tourists use the place and how they get swimming, how the fish, the different fish species moved around and used the habitat and ate each other. So that was a fairly fine-scale model, so we could understand the interactions and allow for fine-scale management decisions. But it was embedded in a much more complex, so this is a wiring diagram of that model. So now you know why I think them odd, because I have to deal with these things on a daily basis. But in principle, it's fairly simple. You've got a hydrodynamics model, a bit like what Ryan has talked about. You've got a food web model, a bit like what EcoPath with EcoSim might look like. Then you've got some social network connections, you've got some basic management control theory happening, you've got that agent-based model of the tourists and how they actually make their bigger decisions, who they talk to in the pub dictates what they want to do. They have a Lisa come along and say, well, I'm going to the beach, and we go, oh yeah, okay, we'll do that. So it's how they make their decisions, what kind of things are happening on the global front, so if there's a terrorism strike in Bali, Australians stay home and go to the beach at home instead of going to Bali. So some of those big international events can have a flow-on effect somewhere like this. The hardest part was this tiny little red part in here. What makes people happy and sad? Modelling that was actually the most challenging part of the whole thing, because there is quite a lot of individual differences, but it can be broken down. So I'll get to how you do that in a minute. But the basic idea was to use differential equations and statistical distributions for the really broad scale properties, so things like physics. Then we had metapopulation habitat models, individual fish schools for the more common fish, up to individuals for the top predators. We broke down the human world in the same way. For large scale economics, like the national economics or the global trade, we had input-output models and see general equilibrium models conditioning that. And then as we moved up, we had the social network of the people inside the town and how they interacted with tourists. And then we played out the individual decisions by the people interacting with that environment. So we telescoped in detail where we needed the focus and where the processes came down to individual decisions. We also did that within the life history of some of the species. So we didn't want to track every single larvae. So we had patches of larvae that were represented statistically. We had schools of juvenile fish, and then when they became adults and were very rare and very highly sought after by recreational fishermen, that's when we went down to individuals. So in space, in time, in taxonomy, but even in the life cycle, we use different scales and different processes at different spots. So what does one of these kind of models look like under the hood, as they would say in Australia? So if we pick Antarctica as our domain of interest, and we're going to zoom in one little spot, you get the bathymetry of the area and you think about how you're going to break up that space. So are you going to represent it with polygons matched to the major features? Or are you actually going to pull that out across the surface, or are you going to use a grid? So that's sort of decision making. How are you going to handle time? Are you going to handle it in a sense where you represent each one of the little processes? Are you going to do it by day, by week, by month, by year? So you have to think about what major events coming and going. So migration, for instance, in and out of the system. How are you going to handle that? So if this is the bathymetry of the system and the sediments across the top of that, then you've got your habitats to represent. So ice is obviously a major habitat down there. Then you've got to think about how to represent your food web. What do you put in the food web? Which bits do you leave out? So down there, they hadn't really put much of the benthic food web in before. They've been pretty much focused on what was happening with krill and the large predators. But it turned out the benthos was equally important, so we had to represent that. So you can use things like statistical properties or just smearing things for things like bacteria, or we'll find things that are kind of ubiquitously everywhere. So you effectively embed the plankton model inside your physics model so that it's everywhere and you don't have to worry about that stuff. Then and you don't have to represent the individual ages of things. They can just be pools of biomass like they are in ecopark. Then for other things, you can either continue that idea of just having pools of biomass everywhere, like ecopark does, or you can start to break it out. So if you chose to take an agent-based approach, you might define schools based on their interests. So where do they like to feed? What habitat do they like? What temperatures do they like? So what ages are they? So lots of fish in the southern hemisphere go deeper as they get older. Then you can come to your top predators. So again, you can still continue to represent them with biomass pools, or you could use an age-structured differential equation model like they do in stock assessments, or population viability assessments. Or you can go the agent-based route where you play out what these individuals do. So that was the route that we chose for Antarctica, because it was important for some of these rare species what the identity of that individual was. So I don't know how many of you have watched Ice Age, the movie, but in one of those movies, the last female dodo falls over the cliff. That's kind of an important individual to have known about. So that's a case where you would use an agent-based model, because the identity of the individual and what it did was really important. Using an agent-based approach also makes it easier for animals to move in and out of the system, but you can actually use mathematical tricks to do that anymore. Okay, so then you've got the humans on top, and again you can represent that in a range of ways. So we had impact response function, so a simple equation for how human use might create waste in Antarctica. But we more finely played out how the fisheries work. For instance, the illegal fishing, how they shared information, how they avoided being captured. Those kinds of stuff for a much finer detail. We also had the communication networks, but we played out the political situation. Why can't they come to a decision in having an MPA in Antarctica? What's the political negotiations and game playing happening there? And how does that feed back to the management decision process so that you can close that adaptive management loop? The last key part of this is including error, because nothing actually ever quite goes the way you expect. So whether you're representing error as the scientist and you're mimicking how the scientist works, or you're just being aware of what noise and error can be in your system, you have to think about the shape of the area, the biases and the variance. And this is a pretty good way of thinking about the way the error works. So you actually have the truth of the system you have your observations. So despite what many field scientists would like to hit me over the head with as a modeller, the field scientist doesn't always get truth either. They have a little bit of observational error, so there's observational uncertainty around that truth. Then you come along with your model, and you're not quite sure exactly how good that is at matching the truth. You're measuring this, you're judging your model based on this residual match between your prediction and your observation. In actuality, you're trying to minimise this, how close to truth you are. So quite often, if you're messing up this, you're also messing up that. But there has been occasions when this was huge, but this was actually spot on. So don't always assume that the model is at fault if you're not matching the observation error. But go back and check that the data itself is a reasonable approximation of what they're trying to measure. So this is ultimately what you're trying to do, is to make your predictive uncertainty lie within your observational uncertainty to minimise all of these potential sources of error. And you can do this by building in assessment models and mimicking how well your observations are going and stuff. Now the key take home behind this is that you do need to think of models as like a Lego set. They've got their components. You need to think about what you need when you're building your little Lego set. You need to think about what you want to put in, how much detail you want to put in, what you're intentionally leaving out, but also try lots of different options. So there's not enough real-world data yet for us to have a Turing test for an ecosystem model. So you always have to be aware of the uncertainty that you have. Now the best practices for the kinds of questions that I ask around thinking about what the climate, the global future might be, is to use what-if models. If you're trying to be a weatherman, obviously a prediction is a forecast is much more appropriate, but for the kinds of questions I ask, the what-if model is the most. My strongest recommendation is to think. You save yourself a lot of wasted time if you think first, not last, she says from experience. Now I'll write out another one. So I will just have to shout now. So you have to think before you play, but play a lot so you understand what's going on. You need to identify some anchors to tie you down into that reality. So if we thought about our kitchen before, we need some props to tie us down. Okay, that's probably better for my voice. You need some anchors to tie you down to make sure you're being real, but don't over tie it. You need to allow some flex in that system so that you get the emergent properties. You have to be really careful about the feedbacks and the delays. They're the key part of about how a system really works. So to ignore them, you do so at your own peril, because your model probably won't work very well. The fine resolution won't work in every dimension, and there's a trade-off between dimensions. So if you think of it as a big elastic sheet, you can't pull that sheet out in every direction. So if you've got a rubber band, you can't pull, because it'll snap. You have to, if you pull in this direction, you have to give it that one. So it's like that. So if you have lots of spatial detail, you probably can't have very much ecological detail. Or if you have lots of physiological detail, you probably can't have as much space or time detail. So you have to give trade-offs between each other. And there's a trade-off between the detail in the model and the amount of data required. So some of the models I work with are quite shallow in the way that they treat any one part of the system because they deal with the whole system. Whereas if you're worried about cardiology of a heart, you might go into very fine detail about how the heart must work. But mix it up. There's no one right model. But I would recommend this version of the world. So rather than having one big model that rules everything, try lots and lots of different options.